Hello and welcome to the penultimate session in our third series on architecture and philosophy, where we're looking at the work of Julia Kristeva. I'm delighted to have Zuzana Kovar here with me today. This is part then of a series which is for which we have the final session next week. We were extending upon a previous set of two series, which have been supported by Tongs University and FIU, where we've been looking at the role of philosophy and what lessons architects can learn from philosophy. We start off with Slavoj Žižek and we've worked our way through. This is the third series. All of these are uploaded onto our YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel information is here recorded at the bottom. So they're available for free for anyone who wishes to access them. And the idea is to create some kind of repository of knowledge about these crucial thinkers. In many cases, they've already died, and we have no video recording of them speaking English, or indeed of anyone talking about them. So the idea is to, in the age of the podcast, is to create this repository for scholars around the world. And what's more, with the doctoral consortium, the whole initiative is to say that the idea of having a single professor in a classroom talking to a small group of students no longer makes much sense when we can have a platform that can be a worldwide platform that everyone can access, regardless of where they come from, and so on. So this is a part of our contribution, as it were, to knowledge. Today, then, we are going to be dealing with Julia Kristeva, one of the most important thinkers in many ways from recent the history of French intellectual thought. She is herself from Bulgaria originally, and she could be described as a philosopher, a feminist thinker, a psychoanalytic thinker, a writer, and many things. I'm going to focus on myself, on her work, on the aspects of psychoanalysis and the connection between her world and the world of architecture. And even though she does not explicitly refer to architecture, as far as I'm aware anyway, I think her work is highly relevant to architecture. Zuzana is joining me today. Zuzana is herself originally from the Czech Republic. She is an Australian. She's teaching now at Griffith University in Brisbane, and she's undertaken a PhD initially under Helene Frichot on Julia Kristeva. She's therefore the expert from the architectural community, should we say, on Julia, and she has published the book Architecture and Abjection on the work of Kristeva and the relevance of Kristeva for architecture. So it's great to have Zuzana here today. I'm going to say a few preliminary remarks. I will say that I hadn't quite intended to mushroom into being as long as they are, but they're somehow highly relevant, since today is Easter Sunday, at least in the States. Even if in Australia it's now Easter Monday. So welcome to this session, and let me say something before handing over to Zuzana, the real expert, shall we say, on Kristeva. I'll just start by saying that I'm just listing out some of the areas that we're going to be looking at. I am not going to be talking about abjection at all. This is something that Zuzana will be talking about. But I will connect things to the theme of mimesis, largely because my book on camouflage was about that, and I've dedicated a chapter in my book to the work of Kristeva, and especially to the theme of melancholia. The notion of Eros and Thanatos will be echoing throughout, the logic of death, of sacrifice, and then something called the thetic crisis, the thetic divide, which I will explain in some detail, before focusing on, I think, what is the key term that I will be addressing, that of melancholia, and the relationship between melancholia and the world of art, and also, I would say, the world of architecture. And then, just as a kind of aside, I want to kind of further explore the difference in Kristeva's terms between the term Eros and Agape. I'm sure Zuzana will be developing even further. So let me start, though, with a kind of comment, a background comment. I'm just trying to situate, shall we say, Kristeva's work in relation to other thinkers, in a more broad sense, and then we'll be going much more deep into the question of Kristeva's thinking with Zuzana herself. So my interest in her stemmed from this book, Camouflage, which is really about the question of how do we identify with the buildings in our surroundings. I was once struck by, I invited Luce Rigare, one of the three thinkers, the three leading French feminist thinkers in the 1990s, along with Helene Frichot, whom we've already addressed, and of course Kristeva herself. I was once talking about how we can relate to buildings. Lucio Ligore said, I invited to the AA, and we had a discussion afterwards. She said, well, you can't relate to buildings. That's you can only relate to people. And yet, what was interesting was she was at the time bemoaning the fact that she was being forced out of her apartment because the owner of her apartment was selling the property and so on. I said, but there you have it. You are relating to your buildings. And so the camouflage book was born of that. How do we, using a much more kind of progressive theoretical framework than some of the ideas of, let's say, someone like Heidegger, start understanding how we can connect and relate to buildings and to the life world in general. And this image on the front cover, Francesca Woodman, really says a lot about that possibility. You can see her here photographing herself with what looks like a kind of a fishbone, which kind of echoes the kind of reinforcing bars in the plasterwork, the stucco behind there. Francesca Woodman, for those who don't know, is like the Sylvia Plath of American photography. She was an exquisite photographer who took her life at an early age, tragically, and like Sylvia Plath herself, but also in some senses opens up that kind of story about art, artistic expression, and sacrifice and death that will, I think, reverberate through today's session. And the theme of camouflage is not necessarily literal camouflage, but the logic of camouflage, of course, we know from the world of, let's say, the military, is about how you preserve life. How you preserve life, in some senses, by becoming part of your surrounding, by feigning death, in some sense, feigning the possibility of becoming part of that world around us. And of course, we have many examples in the world of the natural kingdom of creatures that either seek out habitats that they're familiar with or familiarize themselves with the unfamiliar, not least the chameleon itself. There's an astonishing creature that has the capacity to blend in or indeed stand out in certain moments from the environment around it. And this curious capacity this visual capacity to adapt and change the color of its skin. In fact, although the chameleon is a kind of master of this, possibly the biggest master of all is not the chameleon, but some of the kind of cephalopods, the octopuses and so on, and here you see one remarkably appearing from its kind of camouflage, hiding, completely blended in and then escaping, as it were. You can see the capacity of a much more immediate way of responding to the environment. And I think this is itself something that is deeply fascinating, the speed at which these creatures can suddenly change color and adapt. And all this are tactics of survival. By feigning death, by feigning the kind of resemblance to the world around them, they are effectively preserving life. And at this point, we get to see automatically the way in which life and death are played into one another in a much more dialectical way than often is given credit to. There is something going on throughout the animal kingdom to do with survival, not just the survival of camouflage soldiers, but also of creatures themselves. My insight into this world was the first opening into how we could possibly theorize the possibility of identification, not just with buildings, but also with the life world. I'm not talking here about necessarily physically resembling the world around us, like in camouflage, but thinking oneself into a certain space, identifying with buildings, becoming familiar with it, growing at home, growing into, let's say, a habitat and an environment, which is what we do the whole time, was triggered off by this rather curious comment that I came across by Adorno in an essay, Functionalism Today, which I included in Rethinking Architecture. So this comment refers to something very, very strange, the mimetic impulse. According to Freud, symbolic intention quickly allies itself to technical forms like the airplane, and according to contemporary American psychological research, American research into mass psychology, even to the car. Thus, purposeful forms are the language of their own purposes. By means of the mimetic impulse, the living being equates himself with objects in his surrounding. That's his terms. Now, what was the first time I read this, I thought mimetic impulse, no idea what that means. Let's ignore that. But then I came back to it and began to realize that the theme of mimesis is actually a really interesting one. And I want to refer back to Freud, who rethinks the term mimesis beyond the normal kind of received version of this, say from Plato and others, as simply a form of imitation, to be this kind of creative assimilation with the world, a form of identification. And Freud refers to this in his book of jokes, and he makes this comment about how we identify, for example, with somebody slipping over a banana skin. Here we see Charlie Chaplin slipping over a banana skin. And his point is that through our bodily memories of what it's like to be slipping over to the slipperiness, and even though we haven't fallen over banana skin ourselves, we can, in some senses, identify with Charlie Chaplin slipping over through these kind of bodily memories. But importantly, and this is the important question when it comes to Kristeva also, we also keep a certain distance and are able to, as it were, laugh at that possibility. We can laugh at the Charlie Chaplin falling over his banana skin. And what he says, Freud, at this point is, this has amazing potential in the realm of aesthetics, but takes it no further. In the sense, my book Camouflage was trying to take the theme of mimesis and take it further. I want to then just kind of pick up on something that's also in Camouflage, the kind of theme of life and death, certainly as it comes out of the work of Freud, and just mention briefly the kind of the notion of the womb itself, which in some senses is so important to all of us, because this is in some ways our first experience of a form of architecture, shall we say. For Freud, it's a kind of a period of paradise. He refers to the nirvana of the womb, as though we're in this womb. We are looked after by the mother. We are floating in this sea of amniotic fluid. We are kept warm by the mother. We are nurtured. We are fed by the mother. We are in this kind of paradise. And then for Freud, the disaster comes when one day we are, in a sense, ejected from this paradise into this hostile world. We have to look after ourselves. We have to keep ourselves warm. We have to feed ourselves and so on. And according to Freud, all subsequent life is premised on the regressive compulsion to return to the nirvana of the womb. Now, in that kind of comment, you get this kind of weird assimilation or connection between life and death, as though they begin to fold into one another. And one can imagine, for example, how often life comes out of death, in the sense of maggots feeding off a decayed corpse, or indeed how death comes out of life. You think of maybe a firework which eventually kind of fizzles out and so on. The two are connected in a way that maybe are not so apparent. And it's this theme of life and death and feeding into one another that I want to pick up on, in a sense, in the discussion today. So the two are, in some senses, kind of dialectically connected in a way that we maybe not so apparent to us. Architecturally, or in terms of the visual culture, we can think about these two kind of connected, interconnected urges in terms of these two icons, the Medusa's head, which when you see the Medusa's head directly will turn you into stone, which itself is a very architectural moment. You freeze, you become part of stone. Or indeed Daedalus, who is credited as being the first ever architect here, fashioning the wings out of wax and feathers for his son Icarus, who of course tragically flew too close to the sun and they escaping from the Minotaur and died. But the point about this is that Daedalus was capable of making statues so lifelike that they appeared to come alive. And one thinks of maybe of the kind of tableau vivant, these kind of living statues you find in places like the Ramblas in Barcelona, where people pose as though they are dead and then come alive. So this theme, though, of life and death, of the frozen and the animate, the inanimate and the animate, is actually much more dialectically connected than we might give credit to. Here I want to refer to a comment made by Slavoj Žižek, who makes the contrast between the photograph and the movie. And he says, well, of course, we often think about these as being complete opposites, but actually they are themselves connected. Well, what is a photograph than a frozen moment taken from an animated continuum? And what is a movie but a series of these frozen moments, which is, as it were, stitched together to form a video? And it's this theme of life and death that in some ways, and how they are connected, which will be the center of everything that we're going to be talking about today. And I'll just mention briefly Holbein's Dead Christ, because I know Zuzana is going to talk about this later on, and just talk about just briefly how and these are the comments that Kristeva makes about this unbelievable. Let me go back a second, and of course, again, it's Easter Sunday, which makes it in certain state makes this remarkable. It's the very realism of the explicit realism of this painting that, in some sense, is so shocking. You can see the rigor mortis almost setting in with the finger, the kind of the mark of the nail from crucifixion, and the wounds and so on. And this is, in some sense, a kind of a shocking moment, and it's exactly this that Kristeva talks about. But what is interesting for Kristeva, of course, is the fact that when we go to, I have to say that I was brought up in a monastery. I was taught in a monastery. I'm no longer in any way religious, although I go to churches to look at the architecture. But certainly that is my sort of background. And one of the comments that she kind of makes is that the strength, as she puts it, of Christianity is that by every time that we go to Mass and take Holy Communion, we somehow identify with Christ, with the sacrifice of Christ. And through identifying with the sacrifice of Christ symbolically, we are in some senses innovated and we are restored in some sense. And therefore, that for Kristeva marks the real power of Christianity, the way in which we identify with the crucifixion of Christ. And this is a comment of mine from Camouflage. Although the painting is about death and loss, it hints at a closer affinity between the work of art and loss as articulated through death, to the point where this affinity serves to highlight and reinforce the role of art as a mechanism whose purpose is to transcend death. I think this is the important point that is being made, is that we are able, through art, we can live on through art, although art in some senses can mimic or embody aspects of sacrifice and death. And this, of course, is implicit throughout architecture. Let me simply kind of comment that there are stories throughout the history of architecture where sacrifice has been involved in as a way of giving life, shall we say, to buildings. There's a famous story of Master Manol in Romania, a builder who was trying to build the Black Church, and it kept collapsing the whole time. And eventually, he has a vision from God who says, "Well, if you wall up your wife into the building, if you sacrifice your wife, it'll make the building and it will make the building survive." And of course, that's what he does. Tragically, he persuades his wife to stand there and then builds her into the wall, very literally. It ends tragically for Master Manol for other reasons, which I won't go into now. But the point is, there are many stories of this. There are stories, for example, of people tricking people into standing and measuring their shadow and incorporating that shadow into the building itself in terms of the proportion, the dimensions of the building itself. And of course, those people also die, as though you were stealing their shadow and so on. So there are stories throughout the history of architecture of the logic, of the impulse of sacrifice. But for Kristeva, this sacrifice, if seen symbolically, is not a negative thing. Literal sacrifice is, of course, harsh, but there are ways in which one can see the role of sacrifice as a way of actually containing containing death itself. Sacrifice has been viewed as an unleashing of animal violence and commemoration of pre-human bestiality. But in our opinion, classical anthropological sociology has a more accurate view, assigning sacrifice an ambiguous function, simultaneously violent and regulatory. For sacrifice designates precisely the watershed on the basis of which the social and the symbolic are instituted. The thetic that confines violence to a single place, making it a signifier. Far from unleashing violence, sacrifice shows how representing that violence is enough to stop and concatenate that order. The next kind of important step, picking up on that discussion about Freud and the womb, and then moving on to Lacan, is a crucial moment in the development of the individual, of the child, that Lacan refers to as the mirror stage. And this is a moment roughly around 6 months, as I recall, where the child suddenly recognizes itself in the mirror as an object within a world of objects. And this is a kind of shock for the child because it realizes that it's no longer connected to the mother. It's the mother feeds it and looks after it, but it realizes actually that it's an independent being. And this is, Lacan describes this as an alienating identification. But it is a crucial process in terms of developing as an individual. We sacrifice the mother. We break away from the mother in order to establish ourselves as a separate entity and therefore to encourage the possibility of actual identification. So this is an important moment where we facilitate the possibility of actually forming a bond, not just with other people, but of course also with architecture, because we have relinquished that primary bond with the mother, herself. And this is the kind of important thing for Kristeva, this idea that we shouldn't be lost in our surroundings. I mean, in the end, or even though the chameleon or the octopus is seemingly part of its surroundings, it's not. It's doing it in order to preserve its identity. The thetic crisis, therefore, for Kristeva, is that the crisis of the boundary failure, the failure to distinguish ourselves from our environment and therefore to establish our individual subjectivity. And this is a comment I make here that by thetic crisis, Kristeva means boundary failure, a crisis that is of individual subjectivity. The crisis prompts the reenactment of an earlier moment of identity creation, the moment when the subject rejects the mother in the struggle for a separate identity. For Kristeva, this amounts to a mimetic crisis, a crisis, that is to say, of non-differentiation. In order to establish a separate identity, the subject must effectively murder the mother. This brings us to the theme of melancholia, which is in a way where the connection or the role of art as a kind of form of connecting with that outside world comes in. And of course, traditionally in history, melancholia was one of the four biles of black bile and so on. But I want to refer to it in the context of what Kristeva is talking about. Melancholia is a fundamental theme in the work of Kristeva. It is inextricably connected with with artistic creation. On the one hand, the artist has to kind of somehow withdraw inside the self, to draw internally and upon internal resources in order to kind of to find that thing. But then it uses the world of art itself to break free of that and to connect with the outside world. Melancholia, by contrast, it represents the opposite in some sense, with the failure to connect with the outside world. And that often in the case of suicide, of people who are contemplating suicide, it's precisely because they cannot connect. They cannot find meaning in the world outside. So by a curious paradox then, art is both born of melancholia or of the conditions of melancholia, but also becomes a way of transcending melancholia. Just a quote from my camouflage book: if artistic expression offers the possibility of transcending death, then melancholia, a form of living death, represents the opposite pole. Artistic expression may open up and restore the subject, whereas melancholia threatens to close off the subject and deny the possibility of access to the outside world. In their responses, the artist and the melancholic opt for two diametrically opposite positions, yet according to Kristeva, the two remain dialectically the same. And one thinks as maybe of moments in history, the kind of poetry that was coming out of the Second World War, and the First World War, sorry, the work of Sigrid Sassoon and others, Wilfred Owen, which really, almost out of the horror of that, something came forward that was deeply, deeply poetic. Not only do artistic expression and melancholia share common origins, but the one may serve to counter the other. While the artist always threatened to be melancholic, the melancholic may seek some relief through art. The message in Kristeva is that art is born of, but also transcends melancholia. That is perhaps the most important thing that I have got to say today. Art is born of, but also transcends melancholia. This brings me to the other kind of rethinking this kind of question of how we can think about art in terms of a form of love. In fact, the theme of art and love and religious devotion are completely connected in the world of Kristeva. So on the one hand, we have a certain form of narcissism. For Freud, narcissism is problematic. It's a kind of childish delusion for Freud. It is a failure to see the other in the other. And what Kristeva is looking for is a different kind of love, a different kind of love, which is what she refers to as agape, a kind of higher form of love, which is in many ways the kind of, for her anyway, a kind of the sort of love we might have for God. When Kristeva refers to connections between art and love, she has a particular form of love in mind. She's referring to agape, a higher form of love, which enacts a union with God. Agape is more mystical than mere Eros, the common form of love. It is a selfless, charitable love. Agape is desire. It involves an openness and identification with the other. Agape is, in a sense, is to be able to love the other as a self, and as opposed to the kind of narcissistic thing where you fail to see the other in the other. So agape is something that she's trying to promote, and she sees connections between agape and the world of art and indeed of architecture. And it's through this logic that we can see these kind of connections of how we can transcend that sort of thetic divide in some senses through architecture and through art. Here I'm showing you Vitruvius's The Vitruvian Man, which by a strange coincidence, and it wasn't planned, is actually, you can contrast this or compare this to certain Renaissance crucifixes. In fact, many of the Renaissance crucifixes are based on Vitruvian proportions. At the same time, one can see in some ways how this Vitruvian man is in some senses Christianized. It is like presented like Christ on the cross. I wrote an article once called Vitruvius Crucifixus, Crucified Vitruvius, that was pointing out this way in which this kind of was working. And of course, we get the theme then of death, of the crucifixion, working its way through this theme of the Vitruvian man. And there is, of course, so this, if we think about Eros and Thanatos, Eros is actually that which disturbs. It's what brings things to life in some senses, whereas Thanatos is that which brings things to resolution and quiet. And we can see this as a kind of, in some senses, as an articulation of Thanatos, as that which brings resolution in quiet. By contrast, there is another version of Vitruvian Man, which many of you might not know about, but it is one in which we can see the erotic written very precisely into it. This is Vitruvian Man as inscribed in a very different way. And of course, the version that we have of Leonardo's Vitruvian Man somehow combines these two. The notion that Eros and Thanatos, of life and death, are inscribed within this. But part of the point about this is to the idea of the human figure as being inscribed within the architecture itself, in both the plans and the elevations, and indeed the details of the building, the kind of physiognomy of the face itself, is an attempt to, in some sense, relate human beings to their environment, to somehow can create that connection. So architecture becomes a way of transcending, opening up, as it were, to the outside world. And there are many examples, which I won't go into now, of where we can see the human body inscribed within plans with a definite tendency to try and see what the connection might be. I'm going to kind of just, the final section that I want to talk about today is to make a connection between what I was saying in my chapter of Melancholia about Julia Kristeva and a chapter on the theme of ecstasy, which is also in some sense highly related to what Kristeva was talking about. And this is, many of you will recognize this, one of the most exquisite moments, I think, in the whole history of Western art, architecture, and sculpture. This statue of Saint Teresa in a church in Rome, which, as you can see, is very dramatically lit up from above. And one of the most, I think, one of the most extraordinary moments in history. Of course, Bernini was both an architect and a sculptor. And we can see what is going on here in this astonishing sculpture. This is Saint Teresa, as it were, swooning in a state of ecstasy or rapture. And she wrote about her raptures in her writing. And I'll refer to that shortly. And this is the angel of God with an arrow that is, as it were, plunged into her. And it's a very, very deeply religious moment, but also something that has something else about it that is caught the attention of certain observers and theoretical speculators. What exactly is going on here? What we see there, in some sense, is an articulation of art, of architecture and religion brought together in a curious way. So here's a close-up of this and the arrow, as it were, that is about to be plunged into St. Teresa. And then St. Teresa herself in this curious thing. And of course, this is Bernini's interpretation. Bernini's interpretation of these moments that she refers to in her writing as raptures, of ecstasy, of loss of self in some sense, which he's giving an almost erotic edge to. And I want to talk about that in some more detail in a moment. There is something very, very curious, very, very beautiful, but extraordinary about this. Let me simply comment on the fact that, and I can't quite read the first slide because of the Zoom thing, on these are the comments that Teresa herself, this is how she describes this moment in her own writing. This golden spear, and the angel plunges this into my heart several times, so that it penetrated my entrails. When he pulled it out, I felt that he took them out with it and left me utterly consumed by the great love of God. The pain was so severe that it made me utter several moans. The sweetness caused by this intense pain is so extreme that one cannot possibly wish it to cease, nor is one's soul then content with anything but God. This is not a physical, but a spiritual pain. Through the body, though the body has some share in it, even a considerable share. So gentle is this wooing which takes place between God and the soul, that if anyone thinks that I'm lying, I pray God in his goodness to grant him some experience of it. This is one of the most extraordinary descriptions by Saint Teresa, who was herself a nun, about this moment of religious devotion where she literally loses herself in a kind of ecstasy in this moment of religious oneness with God, as it were. And again, she talks about this again in terms of death, about the point of death, about the agony that carries with it so great a joy that I do not know of any proper comparison. It is a harsh yet sweet martyrdom, yet at the same time the pain is so sweet and the soul is so conscious of its value that it now desires the suffering more than all the gifts that it used to receive. It believes this to be the safest. It believes this to be the safest state too, because it is the way of the cross. And in my opinion, it contains a joy of exceeding worth, because the body has no part in it but agony, whereas the soul, even while suffering, rejoices in the bliss and contentment that this suffering brings. And this is the extraordinary moment of what we'll talk about in a moment, jouissance, the bittersweet moment, which, according to Lacan, is the only moment in which we access the real. That kind of like the moment of the, as it were, the moment, for example, we can see the terrifying angels that Rilke talks about in the second Duino elegy, the sublime moment of aesthetic contemplation, which is an extraordinary thing in itself. I'm just going to stop sharing to make sure that I am connecting with my my audio here. I have got that good. Okay, so this is I want to show you a couple of short excerpts of a movie by Nina Donino. She showed this at the Architectural Association many years ago. This is a movie made in 1993, I think, and it's about Saint Teresa, and it's her own interpretation, but I want to show you it because it really, in many senses, brings this extraordinary statue to life. So this is Nina Donino's movie, At the Point of Death, and you'll see references to death and life and transcending death throughout this particular movie.
Into ruin and decay. Distressed as I was, I forced myself to be active, and though in losing him I was losing all the good and comfort in my life, for he was all that to me, I was so determined not to show my grief that I behaved as if I felt none at all, but I felt as if my soul were being torn from my body when I saw his life depart, for I was very fond of him. That night I had an attack which left me insensible for almost 4 days. They gave me the sacrament of extreme unction. At times they were so sure that I was dead that afterwards I actually found some wax on my eyelids. For a day and a half a grave was left open, and the rites for the dead were performed. After, I was in such a state that my tongue was bitten to pieces, and my throat was so choked that I could not even swallow water. My bones seemed to be wrenched out of their sockets, and there was a great confusion in my head. I could no more move arm, foot, or hand than if I had been dead. All that I could move, I think, was one finger of my right hand. The fainting fits are now very rare, and I am free from the contraction of my nerves during the paralysis and the attacks of fever, though I suffer from morning sickness and cannot take any food until past midday, sometimes not till much later. Now that I take communion more frequently, I have to bring it on at night before I go to bed, with feathers or in some other way, and I think this is much more disturbing. I think I am never quite free from aches and pains, which are sometimes very severe, especially around the heart. She spoke so freely about this and of other things that on the next morning she remarked to me, "How I forgot myself last night." These desires and this love of mine made me lose all sense of proportion. I found myself dying of this desire, this love. It came to me in mighty impulses. Nothing gave me satisfaction, and I could not contain myself. When these impulses come on me, I exert all my strength to resist, because I am afraid of delusions. This desire grows so intense that its extreme distress robs the soul of all consciousness. It seems to be on the point of death, fainting almost completely away in a kind of swoon. Her breath and all her bodily powers progressively fail. Her eyes close involuntarily. If you read in this state, you can scarcely make out a single letter. You hear, but only dimly, as if from far away. It is the same with the tongue. You cannot form nor have the strength to pronounce a single word. One can do absolutely nothing, only utter a few slight moans, not aloud, but inwardly out of pain. It is impossible to describe this wound, this very great but so sweet a pain. It is like being pierced to the depths of the entrails, or sometimes to the heart. It is like a voice crying out to take breath. I wish that someone would explain these death-like yearnings, tell me what they mean. Sometimes my pulse ceases to beat at all. All my longing at this time is to die. I forget everything in this longing, this abandonment, this loneliness. I was thinking just now as I wrote this that a verse which I have already quoted, Telatastiko meum, speaks of the heart being enlarged. I do not think that this happiness has its source in the heart at all. It arises in a much more interior part, like something of which the springs are very deep. Then I heard a very soft voice speaking to me in a whisper. All my hair stood on end with terror. He told me not to consider myself forgotten, for he would never abandon me, and that I must do everything in my power to help myself, and other things as well, that there is no need to repeat.
So that extraordinary video, Now I'm Yours, was made by Nina Danino, as a filmmaker from Gibraltar, sorry, who was used to teach at Goldsmith, and she still does. And it came out in 1983. It was sponsored by Channel 4. But what is interesting about this particular sculpture is that by Bernini is it attracted the attention of a number of different theorists. Jacques Lacan includes a picture of it in his seminar 20. Where he talks about Saint Teresa. I think that his comment here is a fundamental misunderstanding of what Saint Teresa was all about. He makes maybe the obvious kind of comment, or at least the immediately obvious comment, that this seems to be rather kind of curious because there seems to be some kind of form of erotic moment that is contained within this. He sort of sees it as erring from the side of religion into the erotic itself. And this comment he makes in his seminar, it's like for Teresa, you need but go to Rome and see the statue by Bernini to immediately understand that she's coming. There's no doubt about it. Well, I think that's a fundamental understanding, because what we're talking about is not an erotic form of love. I think we can adopt Kristeva's notion of agape as a higher form of love, and that I think is a mistake to collapse the two into one another. And I think that's a comment that's made about Lacan. More importantly, though, I think this becomes an expression of this term jouissance, which is an important expression within post-structuralist philosophy. It talks about this kind of connection in some ways that we see, almost like the moment of Cora, where the sensible and the intelligible are somehow conjoined for a moment. Jouissance in French has actually got a slightly erotic undertone. The word jouir refers in some sense to sexual experience, but it's much more important than that. It's talking about this, it's very unique moment when we actually engage with the real, capital R in Lacan, the only moment we do, in this kind of moment, the bittersweet moment of aesthetic contemplation. As I mentioned, a bit like the terrifying angels. Jeder Engel ist schrecklich in the work of Rilke. This itself is a sublime moment of aesthetic connection, of aesthetic contemplation, when suddenly we engage with the real. Jouissance is the path towards death, insofar as the drives are an attempt to break through the pleasure principle in search of jouissance. Every drive is a death drive. This is a commentary by Dylan Evans, one of the commentators on Lacan. Jules Bataille also comments on Saint Teresa, on this sculpture by Saint Teresa, in his book on eroticism. There's a difference. I don't understand the difference between the title, between the original one, erotism, and eroticism, the more recent version that doesn't have Saint Teresa on the front cover. But this is a comment that Georges Bataille makes about this sculpture. It is the desire to live while ceasing to live, or to die without ceasing to live. The desire of an extreme state that Saint Teresa has perhaps been the only one to depict strongly enough in words. I die because I cannot die. But the death of not dying is precisely not death. It is the ultimate stage of life. If I die because I cannot die, it is on the condition that I live on. Because of the death, I feel because of the death, I feel though still alive and still live on. Saint Teresa's being reeled, but did not actually die of her desire actually to experience the sensation. She lost her footing, but all she did was to live more violently, so violently that she could say that she was on the threshold of dying, but such a death as tried her to the utmost, though it did not make her cease to live. And I think this is in some senses the thing about the thetic divide, where you don't lose your sense of self. You kind of that's the role of art in some sense, to challenge and to call into question the thetic divide, but not to rupture it entirely. So Bataille in some sense takes it to a different sort of level. And he makes this comment where I guess his term erotic is not this, it's slightly different. Erotic activity, by dissolving the separate beings that participate in it, reveals their fundamental continuity, like the waves of a stormy sea. In sacrifice, a violent death disrupts the creature's discontinuity. What remains, what the tense onlookers experience in the succeeding silence, is the continuity of all existence with which the victim is now one. So you can see how sacrifice actually, and one thinks here of the explicit references to Christianity and the death of Christ, is to ensure life. But importantly, I think Bataille also makes the comment, is it precisely through the poetic moment that we can reach this state. Poetry leads to the same place as all forms of eroticism, to the blending and fusion of separate objects. It leads us to eternity. It leads us to death, and through death to continuity. Poetry is eternity, the sun matched with the sea. And this, I think, is the kind of the message also that in some senses Kristeva was referring to, how art can transcend death, can connect us to the world, just as religion can connect us to God himself, or indeed how love in a carnal form can connect us to our partner. It is all a kind of question about the connection that is forged through this. And this points towards the possibility of what Kristeva sees, the connections between art and love. Art can transcend the boundaries of the self, and love also opens us up to the other. Just as the melancholic can be opened up through the realm of art to engage with the world outside, so we can see the fundamental social role of art itself. So what does this mean for architecture? I guess that one could possibly sort of see, and this is the kind of one of Zaha's, an office that was, a hotel room designed by the Zahidid architects, in fact, by somebody that I taught who was at the time reading my work on camouflage, Yael Brossolowski, which kind of speaks about this, what Adorno would call this sensuous correspondence. In other words, the role of architecture, the role of design to connect us, as it were, with the life world. We don't need critical regionalism. All we need is a sensitive form of design. It becomes, therefore, a kind of call for sensitivity, for a sensuousness, which can connect us with the environment around us. And I don't think it's limited to these organic forms in some sense. I think also one could possibly see this in the kind of more classical forms of architecture, because this notion of life and death, of the static, and in some senses of the dynamic being intertwined and feeding into one another. So in some sense, that even though this could seem to be the kind of the articulation of thanatos, the resolution of all tensions, at some point there is something of eros, of love itself, that breaks through. That in some senses it is the design itself that architecture is innovative, that can form this kind of stimulation that in some senses feeds into us. So in some sense, it's not about one form of architecture or another, but rather design. Design as a logic that can connect us to the world, that gives a sense to my mind of the fundamental role of architecture as a form of design in connecting us with the life world. So I'm going to stop sharing that point. My apologies, it took longer than I had intended there, but I think that hopefully that will set the scene for Zuzana's much more informed and much more scholarly understanding of Kristeva, especially in terms of the logic of abjection. So, Zuzana, it's wonderful to see you here today. Welcome. It's of course it's Easter Monday in Australia, whereas we're still in Easter Sunday here in the States. So, Zuzana, it's great. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to hearing your discourse on Kristeva. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Neil. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes. Yep. Great. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Neil, and thanks for the introduction. I think your presentation and mine will probably work quite well together in that you've sort of done a very sort of comprehensive summary of a number of aspects from Kristeva's work that are of relevance to architecture, and I'm going to sort of specifically focus on one aspect, which is the abject and objection. So I think the two will go together quite nicely. So before I begin the lecture, I would just like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I speak today, and pay respect to the elders past and present, and also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So Julia Kristeva is a philosopher who I would say is probably not very extensively discussed within the context of architecture. She hasn't been captured in any of the architectural readers that have been published to date. And we don't really see any sort of full publications dedicated to Kristeva's thinking and its implications or applications for architecture. Her thinking is merely touched on in select journal articles and books, and I would say that to some degree this might be a part of perhaps lack of direct transferability of some of the concepts to the architectural discipline, which we might see in the work of, say, Derrida with concepts like deconstruction, or Deleuze and Guattari and one of his sort of key concepts of the fold. You know, those are kind of concepts which are very sort of easily picked up and translatable into the architectural discipline. One other interesting thing about the slide that is up at the moment is that of the 18 readers that have been published within architecture, only one here is female, which is Irigaray, and so there's a clear sort of bias, I think, towards covering male theorists and philosophers. Akin to most philosophers, Kristeva was a prolific writer, and she published extensively, and her work spanned linguistics and literature, psychoanalysis and philosophy. She also wrote a number of novels and essays as well. Now, while Kristeva's thinking and writing touches on various themes, my personal interest in her work and my knowledge base in terms of her work centers around the concept of the abject and objection. The abject and objection is the focus of Kristeva's book Powers of Horror, which was published in French in 1980 and then translated into English in 1982. There are also a number of subsequent publications which return to the abject, including Kristeva's book Black Sun, and she speaks about the abject or objection in this book in her discussion of Holbein's painting, The Body of the Dead Christ in the Tomb. In Strangers to Ourselves, which was published in 1991 in English, Kristeva discusses displaced or abject people, and then in The Severed Head, she develops the power of horror, which is what she discusses in the first book that we see at the slide here. And she discusses artistic representations of severed heads, or this particular sort of objected body part, throughout history. And it's from the perspective of the abject, or its associated process of objection, that I would like to speak about Kristeva's work in the context of architecture today. So let's start with this quote from Kristeva and her book Powers of Horror. where she says, we may call it a border. Objection is above all ambiguity, because while releasing a hold, it does not radically cut off the subject from what threatens it. On the contrary, objection acknowledges it to be in perpetual danger. So objection, that is both the process of objection and the resultant expulsion, the abject, span a vast array of literature that Kristeva refers to. So she writes about Dostoevsky, Kafka, Toad, Celine, Lautréamont, and Proust. And for her, and also within this literature, the abject and objection encompasses anything that crosses the symbolic, from women to bodily excretions through to crime. It is essentially a discussion of the transgression.
Just one
yep.
comment. At the bottom of your slide, there's this thing saying US. Could you click on hide under the thing so we don't see that?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you.
All good?
Yep.
Okay. Cool. So essentially, the abject and objection is a discussion of the transgression of borders, with the abject sitting on the wrong side of the border and considered matter out of place, which is a quote from the anthropologist Mary Douglas. An objection is in this process which might be understood as fluctuating somewhere in between. When considering objection from an architectural perspective, this crossing of the symbolic is quite often thought of on a spatial level. So we might come across things like dust and dusting, sewage and sewage, architectural detritus, constructions from abject remains, and so on. Within architecture, we often depart from the bodily objection that is of interest to Kristeva, as well as artists and writers engaging with the concept, and are essentially dealing with space and its expulsions or decompositions. As objection is anything that crosses the symbolic, historically it has been classified as the negative. However, to classify objection as the negative is to situate it on the wrong side of the border. It is to render it static and therefore depart from the understanding of it as in between, as ambiguity and as influx. It is essentially to relegate it to the domain of things or of objects, as George Bataille has noted, and to prevent it from having any sense of agency or subversive power. Similarly, issues exist with the precedence of the abject over objection, where we might see a precedence of form and end product over process within architecture. The abject in architecture is often situated on the wrong side of the border. And I would say that the abject in isolation is architecturally a dead end, and it speaks in architectural rhetoric. The presence of objection, on the other hand, I would argue, disrupts architecture's coherence. Objection is unarchitectural. Investigations into the process of objection exist, however, are limited, and when they do occur, are often treated in isolation and or reduced to abstraction. So consequently, what I would like to do in this lecture is to outline the concept of objection, beginning with Julia Kristeva, and to address the translation of this concept into the architectural discipline. I will touch on current shortfalls across both theory and practice, as well as key points, and hence establish the foundations for what I refer to as a productive inquiry into objection. So, what is the abject for Kristeva? The abject is neither subject nor object. It is neither body nor space, but instead a third term. The abject is that which has been expelled from a body and therefore transgressed the boundary between the interior and the exterior. Objection, then, presents an ambiguity, resisting classification and allowing for an investigation only into its state of in-betweenness. And so objection is essentially the process through which the abject is produced. The abject and objection in Kristeva's Powers of Horror is discussed very broadly, and it becomes somewhat of an umbrella term for all that is impure and that is linked to the body or the subject by the process of being expelled either literally and or figuratively, and therefore situated beyond the subject or the I. For Kristeva, objection is related to the pre-Oedipal mother and the constitution of subjectivity. Kristeva is influenced by psychoanalysis and especially by Lacanian psychoanalysis. And within this context, objection is discussed through the Oedipal triangle. In this framework, it is the mother who is understood as the first object of abjection, and who must be abjected by her child in order for that child to enter the symbolic realm. Prior to this abjection, the child resides within the semiotic, which is a realm that Kristeva refers to as Kora, or Plato's empty space, and within which the child understands their body, the mother's body, and their surroundings as part of a continuum. For the child, there is no differentiation here. The semiotic is a precondition to the symbolic, and it must be overcome in order for the child to enter society, to gain language, and become a subject. It is this association of objection with the pre-Oedipal or archaic mother that Kristeva sees as setting up women's position within society, writing that one sees everywhere the importance, both social and symbolic, of women and particularly the mother. Objection, we could therefore say, is intricately tied to the female sex. Despite the transition to the symbolic, the semiotic and the abject cannot fully be repressed. And we see the abject frequently resurfacing in the form of things that threaten our bodily boundary and also our identity. And this happens in order to remind one of the instability of the subject. Objection is then a process that not only instates and reaffirms subjectivity, but also, and perhaps more importantly, has the potential to threaten it. And so here we have another quote, which I won't read, from Kristeva, which speaks to that. So to allude to this kind of instability, despite Kristeva being explicit that the abject is neither subject nor object, she maintains a certain ambiguity between the objecting self, which she refers to as the deject, and the abject non-self. She continues writing that I expel it, but since it is not an other for me, I expel myself. I spit myself out, I object myself out within the same motion through which I claim to establish myself. So what this presents is a very clear slippage between the subject and the abject, an uncertainty of where one ends and where the other begins. I simultaneously expel and I am expelled. I expel an abject and I am the expelled abject. Within the Kristeva passage on the slide, one witnesses the volatility of objection, its evasion to being placed, and it is precisely this slippage, this ambiguity, that both threatens but also fascinates. So if we dwell on one of the key attributes of objection, its ambiguity, it is interesting to note that Kristeva speaks of this ambiguity as only ever pertaining to the abject self and the abject non-self. Nowhere does Kristeva speak of the implication of other entities within this ambiguity, which I think is inevitable given the uncontainment of the leakages. Despite this, she does put forward the following observation by Bataille, that objection is linked to subject-object relations, not subject-other subject relations. I think this point is very critical in Kristeva's writing, and it might be interpreted in two different ways. Kristeva understands the object as the mother, and therefore she interprets the relation between subject-object as one between the subject and the mother. Abjection is then linked to subject-mother relations. It is for Kristeva, therefore, not a matter of the immediate and physical relations that are present in the event of abjection, but rather a matter of symbolic relations. Generally speaking, however, and even for Kristeva, in some sense, the object is an entity other than I. Within the architectural discipline, it is space that has been understood as the object. And so what Bataille's observation poses, I would say, is an implication of objects into this ambiguity generally, but also specifically from an architectural perspective, the implication of space. Abjection is undeniably linked to body-space relations, relations of an immediate and material nature. Although for Kristeva, abjection extends to numerous things across the symbolic, it does not extend to space. Kristeva does not address spatial abjection, despite the fact that it equally crosses the symbolic and threatens our subjectivity. There is, however, one instance where she speaks of an abject body in space. And this occurs in her chapter on Hans Holbein's life-sized portrait, The Corpse of Christ in the Tomb, which we find in her book Black Sun, published in 1989. Black Sun concerns largely depression and melancholia, and although these terms take precedence, the abject, or the sort of the ultimate object, is nevertheless present in the form of the corpse within that painting that is discussed. Kristeva notes various painting and compositional techniques by Holbein, which place an emphasis on the relation between the body of the Christ and also the space of the tomb, which is precisely where abjection has the most effect, where it is visceral and immediate, and where one cannot distance themselves from it. This is a painting of proximity, of intimacy, and of Christ being overcome by abjection. John Lechte, who has written about this particular chapter within Kristeva's book, notes that Holbein paints the scission constituted by the tension between the semiotic and the symbolic, between turbulence and immobility, between life and death. And so the painting, in other words, can be understood as a painting of a scission, of the in-between, or in short, of abjection. As a drawing type, we can understand it as a section, an architectural section that is cut through the tomb within which Christ is laying. There is a cut through the space, but not a cut through Christ's body. Holbein intentionally dissected the space, but not the body of the Christ. Architectural sections are violent. They dissect space, and they allow us, in that sense, to probe the interior. The sectional drawing cuts open the whole. It opens up the boundary between the interior and the exterior, between what might be public and private, and between two spaces that are situated on either side of a boundary. And hence it activates the potential for something to escape. This potential for escape is exactly what we find in Kristeva's text, where she notes that Christ's hand protrudes slightly from the slab. It spills into the sectional cut, into the perimeter walls of the tomb, and therefore it comes to occupy that which is unoccupiable. And we can also see other sort of aspects of Christ's body, and also the sheet spilling into this space. It is interesting that architects and Holbein in this case are always all too eager to dismember space in their drawings and formal manipulations, but not the human body. Despite this, the body still manages to find orifices through which to escape. And so we see Christ's head, which is bent backwards, his mouth is open, which reveals a dark hole that flows into equally dark space of the tomb. His bodily boundary is penetrated at his hands and his feet. And so the body is leaking not only out of the section, but also from inside itself out. It is suspended in the very spasm that Gilles Deleuze often discusses in the work of Francis Bacon. The painting can be read as beginning with the underlying drawing type of the section. However, it is unable to subscribe to the rigid systems of that drawing type. Kristeva notes that this hair and this hand that extends beyond the base, as if they might slide over towards us, as if the frame could not hold back the corpse. What becomes clear from Kristeva's writing through her simultaneous discussion of Christ's body and the tomb is her awareness of the relation between the objecting body and the space of the tomb. What is, however, most important to note about Kristeva's notion of the abject, and what has a profound effect on not only discussions generally, but on its application in disciplines such as architecture, is that it is, as American historian and art critic Hal Foster has pointed out, often seen as a categorization of a series of objects other than I. And so this, I think, clearly invokes an inside-outside dualistic model that is too structural. And to this, we can also add an observation by Hanjo Beresim, where he notes that what is of significance for Kristeva, although she does speak about the dissolution of boundaries that result in an indistinctiveness of two things and of becoming unnameable, what is of significance to her is when differentiations between two opposites become representable, and therefore when they enter language. Kristeva's background is psychoanalytic, and this above all is explicit in her discussions of subjectivity. This background presents itself as problematic to a degree, as although it allows Kristeva to map the various meanings that objection has attained, it does not allow us to move beyond these meanings. Most importantly, tracing objection back to the pre-Oedipal mother, gendering it from the very beginning, serves to promote rather than question the association between objection and woman, and hence woman's position within society. There are therefore very clear limits, I think, to Kristeva's writing, which prescribe the direction from which one is able to approach objection. So if we now shift the focus to the architectural discipline and its dealings with not only the abject and objection, but also more broadly gender and its implications for space, we see a parallel series of issues and shortcomings to those that are prevalent within the philosophy of Kristeva. Within architecture, the relationship between woman and objection is expanded to woman-space objection, and it is utilized to discuss any abject, womb-like or binding space, from a cave to a grotto, cellar, sewer, to the interior and also the home. In the same way that Kristeva traces objection's origin back to the pre-Oedipal mother, to the maternal, there is also a symbolic origin of architecture, of dwelling, that has been traced back to the womb as the most primitive form of shelter and covering. And Elizabeth Gross, in her book Architecture from the Outside, summarizes this very well in this quote. Further, in the same way that Kristeva writes that the association of objection with the pre-Oedipal mother sets up women's position within society, we witness the repercussions of architecture's symbolic origin through the classification of all that is concave and womb-like, so the cave, the interior, the home, as feminine. Mirjana Lozanovska writes about this, stating that it is clear that the cave is a metaphor for the maternal womb, and through the process of metaphorization, the attributes of the maternal womb are transferred over to this space, over to the figure of the cave. And so what we see is that these types of spaces are at once gendered, they are at once objected. and they are at once understood psychoanalytically. In taking on associations of the feminine, these spaces have all become what Freud terms object surrogates. And so they are surrogates for the key female reproductive organ. Examples of object surrogates and references being made to the penis as structure versus the womb as whole and absence in architecture are well summarized in a number of articles. Some of those, Megan Morris's publication or chapter, and also Alessandra Ponte's chapter, which we both find within Beatrice Colomina's Sexuality and Space. Most notable, however, in this instance is perhaps Friedrich Kiesler's The Endless House from the 1950s, which Maria Luisa Palumbo describes in this way, as per the quote on the slide, and she sort of draws attention to the house being like a womb, the idea of formless matter and the sort of the natural folds that we find within this house. Here, there is a clear association between the womb, the cavity, the sensual, the dark, the visceral, the cave, and also formless matter. In a description of Carlo Scarpa's Fondazione Mercieri from 1968, Marco Frascari then goes one step further, and he likens the water within the concave-shaped bathrooms in this project to amniotic fluid. And so again, you can sort of see the pink elements that are pulled out of the quote, which sort of speak to that. So gendering spaces and associating them with women's bodies, I think is, of course, sort of largely unproductive. And in the late 1980s, Victor Bergen and Dennis Hollier commented in two separate instances on how simplistic, direct, and metaphorical such dualistic associations are. They weren't writing on the abject and objection, but they were writing on similar concepts that can be classified as negative, and that can also be transferred over to the architectural discipline. And so they spoke about the sublime and grottos, and also the Italian labyrinth. Despite comments such as these coming up, publications continued to emerge in the 1990s. And within these, we were faced with discussions of objects on the wrong side being of the border being termed ugly. By Mark Cousins, the womb as dirty by Jennifer Bloomer, and the symbolic abject by Henry Urbach, as well as others. And in short, we were faced with texts that spoke to a duality and specifically to the negative side of that duality. Whether this happened directly by the writer, or whether the writer was merely pointing out the long-standing associations between the things that are situated on the wrong side of the border. There are, of course, instances within these articles and books, as well as within others, that begin to map out a framework for the in-between, and also start to kind of consciously erode the binary oppositions. What becomes apparent through all of these associations between abjection, women, and space is that it is the same dualistic paradigm that binds abjection to the feminine as binds abjection to certain spatial types within architecture. And this then also continues through the 2000s. One of perhaps most recent and much more valuable publications is Helene Frichot's book, Dirty Theory, Troubling Architecture. This book disrupts our thinking and also ways of working, arguing, as per Donna Haraway, that we must always stay with the trouble, and that we must, as per Mary Douglas, challenge the notion of the body as a hermetically sealed unit and to redraw a leaky boundary. And that also, again, as for Haraway, we need to break down the boundary between the physical and the non-physical, amongst others. So Frichot's theory places us immediately at risk of contamination, which I think is one of the reasons why it is a valuable publication. So when we look at how the abject and objection have been engaged with in built work or within practice, many similar shortcomings, but also some very exciting potentials emerge within architecture. And I would like to touch on 4 categories: dust and dusting, weathering and spatial objection, abject constructions, and objection as a process. So starting with dust, in his critical dictionary, Bataille wrote the following of dust. He spoke about Sleeping Beauty and the fact that, you know, the storytellers forgot that Sleeping Beauty, when she would wake up, would be covered in a thick layer of dust. And, you know, that this is kind of a critical point that was missed. In the second paragraph that I don't have up on the slide here, but that forms the definition of dust, Bataille writes of maids arming themselves with feather dusters and vacuum cleaners. And this comment, in a way, places dust or the keeping of dust squarely in the middle of the feminine realm. For Bataille, however, dust is more importantly a register of time. It is a sign of material change, or as David Gisson has more recently noted, a marker of history. At first glance, dust may be understood as approaching a reading of the abject architecturally, as an abject of a building itself. In a 2007 journal publication dedicated to architecture and dirt, Ben Kampkin and Paul Dobrozic wrote of the paradoxical nature of dust, noting that dust physically attacks and alters the materials of architecture, while it is in fact partly made of architecture's materials through their wearing, weathering, and ruination, from fragments to debris to powder. So dust's origin or association with a physical entity, a building, its expulsion, and the threat that it poses upon that expulsion in many ways echoes Kristeva's description of abjection. Where Kristeva, however, clearly speaks of the human body, here that body becomes replaced by space, such that it is not I that expels, but a building. The threat that such a spatial objection poses is rendered explicit in Bernard Shumi's advertisement of the rotting philosopher, where we move one step further and it is not the building that expels, the building is expelled. And architecture is presented not as society's ideal nature or as an untouchable symbol, but rather its opposite. It parallels the ultimate abject, the rotting corpse of modernism's firstborn. Abjection, therefore, does not merely threaten a building or space itself, it can threaten the architectural discipline. And these are a series of photos from René Barry of the Villa Savoie, where it was basically crumbling to the ground before it got renovated. So in terms of dusty exemplars, there are many that proliferate architecture's history. Giovanni Battista Piranesi's etchings of a dust overrun Rome. We can also talk about Le Corbusier's attempts to rise above the dust-ridden streets through his Palotti typology, and also more contemporary instances such as Jorge Otero Palis's ongoing project, The Ethics of Dust, which I think started around 2008 and has since had various reincarnations. And this utilizes latex to take a series of imprints or pollution casts of the built-up dust on building surfaces. And on the left-hand side here, we have a project from Heidi Booker, who is an artist from the 70s, or she produced this work in the late 70s, who's doing very much the same thing that Jorge Otero Palis is doing now. So what is most useful when speaking of dust from the perspective of objection is rather than solely seeing it as a material thing, seeing it as an abject, is acknowledging its operational nature. And it is this operational nature that it shares with not only abjection, but also the informe, which comes from Bataille, and further dirt. Teresa Stoppani, who has written about dust, writes that, quote, dust can be seen as part of a strategy that moves from a static consideration of the object, of research, of study, of making, to an agency of change as alteration of form, and that it becomes the material and also the agent for the project, unquote. She then further comments on the productive nature of considering dust as a process and also as a verb, rather than merely an object. And so, to me, there is it is clear that there are instructive connections between the processes and products of abjection and dusting, and between the abject and dust. Despite this, what remains critical here, I think, is the workings with dust as both a product and a process, albeit an abstract process, and the activation of the term as a verb, in order to manifest an architecture that is open on a number of levels. And I think there's another quote. So, in further examining the way that abjection has been addressed within architectural practice, we can look at discussions and projects related to weathering, or what can be understood as spatial abjection. Weathering is spatial abjection. It is a building expelling itself from inside out. It is a building that is in flux. Weathering takes many forms. It can be staining, corrosion, vegetal growth, mold, rot, and so on. And it is embodied within every building to various degrees. From the accumulation of dust on a windowsill that might happen on a daily basis, to the utter ruination of a structure. It is a process that is desirable within architecture for its aesthetic qualities only, when it may be controlled, that is only when we are the agents. So if you think about something like Corten steel. Generally, given the understanding that a building has a point of completion, that it is static, the introduction of any sense of movement that detracts from this final point is seen in a negative light. Yet, if we return back to Bernard Tschumi, as stated in his advertisement, he writes that the most architectural thing about this building is the state of decay within which it is. And so there's a pointed remark here on modernism, but simultaneously there is a proposition here that decay or spatial abjection does not detract from the building, but rather that is the most architectural thing about it, implying that this notion of movement is critical to architecture and needs to be considered. Although we could speak at length about examples of weathering, I would like to point to a key observation that is of consequence for approaching abjection productively. And this is a rethinking of weathering or spatial abjection as negative. To consider weathering as anything other than negative, we need to approach the building in process, rather than as a product and as an end form. And so, in other words, we need to understand that there is not necessarily ever a point of completion that a building reaches, but rather that a building is constantly in the process of construction, whether this is by man or by nature. And only then may weathering or spatial abjection be considered integral rather than detrimental to architecture. This is precisely the key finding that we see within David Leatherborough and Mohsen Mustafavi's book on weathering from 1993. For them, weathering is a process that can productively modify a building over time. It is nature refinishing the building, and they write that finishing ends construction and weathering constructs finishes. It is nature, therefore, as agent, not man, which leads to a thinking of matter as intelligent, as active. a building is perpetually in a state of construction. And I think this is something that is undeniable, the fact that a building is never complete. So let's have a look at some abject constructions. In their book, Leatherborough and Mostafavi write that dirt is not necessarily impure, that buildings are made out of matter, and that earth is part of their fabric. All buildings are made out of matter, but not all buildings are necessarily made out of earth or dirt. Historically, dirt is again one of those things that is considered abject. But despite the historical understanding of dirt as unclean and as matter out of place, it is the key constituent in numerous constructions. So we find it in the bricks that help form the enclosure for our bodies. We also find it in pottery, which we use to eat and drink from. And we also use that pottery for other things such as planting plants and things like that, which we might then eat and consume within our body. In 2012, the publication Dirt attempted to wrest dirt out of its historical understanding and speak about it in a more productive sense. The publication worked with dirt as fertile and life-giving, and from this perspective, it pointed to dirt's emergent behaviours and its capacity for change. And so one of the key things in this quote is where they talk about dirt being a matrix capable of emergent behaviours, which nurtures growth, spawns development, and ignites change. What is notable in this publication is the observation of dirt's productive qualities and the aim to compile a series of papers and projects that speak to this observation. The publication does not approach dirt as a building material literally, but rather it is interested in, especially within a process work section, which is a chapter, it is interested in utilising dirt's emergent behaviours for the generation of structures such as the one we see on the slide. And in this sense, the projects are then seen as abstract dirt constructions. On the flip side of these kind of abstract dirt constructions or abject constructions, there are examples of literal constructions, constructions from physical abject matter. For such a construction, one can look to an article by Christine McCarthy titled Constructions of a Culinary Abject from 1997, where she speaks about an 18th century house in Exmouth, à la Ronde, and speaks specifically about its construction, which consists partially of culinary abjects, so things like feathers, bones, shells, and sand. The article draws links between the production that occurs within the kitchen and the construction of the house. And there is a boundary, the boundary in this instance is unclear, where waste is produced as part of the cooking and preparation process, and it then becomes construction material for the house. This is a quote from McCarthy's article. She then further describes the construction of the house through more invisible and volatile culinary objects that slowly form layer upon layer on the kitchen walls and ceiling, which happens on an everyday basis within our kitchens as well. And so she speaks about frying and boiling, sending culinary enriched vapours to the walls and ceilings of the kitchen and beyond, and negotiating exits. The culinary waste leaves its traces. It leaves itself within, on its way out. Such a process only becomes possible, I think, through rethinking the classification of carcasses and animal leftovers as waste or trash rather than filth, where filth is unable to be reused, if we refer to William A. Cohen, who makes this point within his publication Filth. What is critical, I think, in McCarthy's article is that she not only discusses the construction of space with waste, but she discusses the process of objection through which the abject, the waste, comes to exist. And so the literal process features in the writing in all its volatility and materiality. And it is this that is quite rare to find within the architectural discipline. So my personal interest with objection lies in the breaking down of bodily and spatial boundaries that occur in the process of objection, and it is the way that the process of objection has been addressed in architecture that I would like to look at in this final section. To speak of process within architecture, above all refers to the design process. Further, it might also refer to adjacent processes such as the construction process. Hence, we could probably, in a simplistic sense, say that process in architecture is directed to an end that yields a product. Similarly, objection yields a product, it yields the abject. If we return to the example from the Dirt publication, what we find is the reinterpretation of Dirt's fertile and life-giving properties of its emergent behaviour into a design process, such that rather than cultivating plant life, these emergent behaviours or processes come to manifest buildings. Such a translation can be seen as a possible way or direction for engaging with these processual and abject concepts, and links into similar contemporary studies that are interested in the utilisation of emergent phenomena to generate buildings. But what this approach entails is an abstraction of the process, which we are beginning with. And so there is a simplification that occurs, which one needs to be aware of. Quite often what happens is that we over-intellectualize, and hence through this process we sanitize the base material qualities that we started working with initially. And so although it seems that we may have managed to engage with the process, of dirt or of objection or dust, we have in fact carefully edited it to prevent ourselves from getting soiled. To reuse a point from Dirt, these projects are all metaphor and no matter. Now, as a point of distinction, Aronsi's hypothetical project Dusty Relief does not only adopt dust's properties, but it also works with dust itself. And so it does not negate the materiality of dust or where it kind of begins. This project moves across not only process, but also the notion of abject constructions, which I think might present another risk, and that is of objectification if we divorce the abject from objection. This project comes perhaps the closest to dealing with dust as both process and product. There are numerous other examples that we could speak about. I have two more. One of those is the work of James Carey, who's an Australian interior designer / artist. And his work is very much process-based. He engages with disused or abandoned spaces and occupies these for a period of time and engages with the materials that are there, undertaking projects such as sweeping the floor, then using the dust and the sort of debris that's been swept up to make drawings, or reordering objects that he finds, which might be considered as thrown out or abject, and then classifies them into categories. And through that process, they then are no longer this kind of abject or this filth. They just become understood as trash, and they sort of gain a different meaning. And so there's very sort of interesting approaches in Carey's work, also sort of touching on maintenance activities, ideas about exhaustion, and also care for buildings within these states. Juliana Preston, who is another interior designer, this time based in New Zealand, follows some similar sort of lines of thought to carry, where she's also interested in maintenance and care of materials and their sort of material agency. And the project that is shown here in the slide is titled Bale, where Preston spent 48 hours with freshly shorn greasy wool within a gallery space. And she was engaging with that material, shifting it around the space, ordering it in various ways. And so it was very much about having a kind of an active dialogue with the material, which might otherwise be sort of considered abject, and having a sort of active and effective and responsive relationship with that material. And so to engage with objection productively, for me, is not a matter of employing objection to necessarily design or physically construct buildings or spaces. It is not about giving objection a use value, but a matter of remaining immersed within the visceral processes of expelling bodies and spaces. And in this sense, Leatherborough and Mostafavi's discussions of weathering and McCarthy's discussions of multiple processes, as well as Frichot's dirty theory, in fact, lend themselves as starting points, I think, for this kind of inquiry. What one may take from these is the engagement with the literal process itself, void of resorting to abstraction in the first instance, and in the second, the criticality of discussing processes in plural, which perhaps, if we read between the lines, begins to edge towards a Deleuzian line of thought that conceives of everything processually. So what one finds after mapping the way that Kristeva speaks of objection and the way that architecture has dealt with this concept and also with similar concepts is that despite Kristeva defining objection as anything that crosses the symbolic, she addresses the concept purely in terms of the human body or the subject. Objection is always brought back to the subject, the I. Architecture, on the other hand, more often than not, addresses objection through its primary medium of space. In her book, Purity and Danger, Mary Douglas has been frequently quoted as saying that it is a mistake to treat bodily margins in isolation from other margins. And what this quote renders explicit for me is the mapping of objection across and the objection mapping of objection across both Kristeva and architecture is that bodily and spatial margins are often treated in isolation. So on the one hand, we often find bodily boundaries and their transgressions, and on the other hand, we find spatial boundaries. I think it's critical, given that objection is anything that crosses the symbolic, that bodily and spatial boundaries are discussed simultaneously. Further, if we imagine a human body or space expelling itself from the inside out, that expulsion lands on and implicates another human body or space. It therefore becomes apparent that objection is a discussion of body-space relations. We must therefore continue to break down and rethink boundaries as we sort of understand them. And Donna Haraway famously argued in her Cyborg Manifesto about breaking down boundaries at these three levels. But I think that what is also critical is to make sure that within the architectural discipline, we look at breaking down the boundary between the human and the non-physical, or between the human and space. For me, this leads to process philosophy, especially the work of Deleuze and Guattari, which I think allows for an extension of Kristeva's thinking, as well as writing and thinking about new materialism, where we start to talk about the agency of matter, and this thinking or these sort of filters are what sort of underlies the much of what you find within my book, Architecture and Objection, Bodies and Spaces and Their Relations, where I begin with Kristeva's concept of the abject and objection, and then extend on that concept through the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and also new materialism. So I will leave it there.
Well, thank you. That was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful. It was such a useful contribution as well. I have to say I was reminded when you were talking of the noise of, I don't know, there were parrots or something outside. It can remind me of European graduate school. You probably don't know this, but a few years ago we had a program there, and it was up in the mountains in Saas-Fee, Switzerland. And we left the doors open outside with these mountain goats, right? And I remember particularly when Serpent Quinta came up with one very profound statement, and then there were the goats outside were going bleh, bleh. It was a very beautiful moment. But thank you. That was exquisite. Let me just kind of kick things off. I'm hoping that just to. First of all, I'm completely on board with the process philosophy thing. We were discussing this in some detail, and the Henri Bergson thing. And I'm at a loss as to the kind of representational logic of triple O. I don't understand that at all. It's kind of curious. And what I would do here. Bernard Schumi is somebody who I think who's actually strangely forgotten. And thank you so much for showing his stuff on Le Corbusier. I think it was really a very interesting insight there. But I think one of the things I would say is that he also talks about the kind of the role of humans. And in fact, he talks about this, how humans activate a space, and a building isn't really a building until it becomes this kind of space of operations. And I think there, to my mind, there's where we can start talking about the kind of the way in which gender identities are performed in a kind of performative way, shall we say, at least, and open up other sort of questions. But I wanted to just kind of like so I mean, I think that, to my mind, I'm wondering whether the real problem for architects is precisely this being kind of constrained by the discourse of objects, to be stuck in this kind of world. It leads to an objectification of often philosophical concepts. I mean, the real problem for me in Deleuze and Derrida is the absolute misunderstanding of Derrida in architectural circles, especially also in Deleuze. You mentioned the fold, but that, to my mind, was absolutely wrong in terms of what Deleuze was saying. He was talking about subjectivities, and architects automatically architecturalize it. He's talking about Maya-phobic forms. And I think this is really the biggest challenge that architects have of being locked into this world of objects and not engaging with the subjective way in which we begin to understand those objects. And we discussed this in the session on Homi Bhabha in particular. And I'm just wondering whether, for me anyway, when I read Kristeva, I see it in those terms. I forgot to mention, when I was teaching in Columbia years and years ago, I sat in on some of the seminars that Kristeva was teaching there. It was a really remarkable experience. But I think that kind of in some ways, this is the hindrance of being locked into this world and unable to break through into a kind of more subjective domain. And I'm just wondering whether, I mean, certainly my take on Lacan is that he shifts away from this kind of discussion of the symbolic in the very simplistic way which you referred to, about how towers are phallic and wombs are female or something like that, and instead talks about symbolization, which is in some ways, it's a very, very different, it's a process, right? It's not the symbol, but symbolization, which is a way of accessing or finding meaning in a kind of space without there being a fixed meaning as such. So how things could be meaningful. And that's where I would locate her work. And I do think that she has a huge relevance to architecture if you can just kind of unpick a kind of what she's suggesting, it seems to me, in terms of this kind of call towards a more kind of poetic understanding or form of expression that makes a difference. I mean, there's a huge difference between, I guess one could say, between the technical manual of I don't know, how to fix a car and the kind of James Joyce's Ulysses. And I think she's referring to the latter as a kind of sensibility in which we infuse architecture. And that's certainly where in the camouflage, I don't think I didn't refer to a single building, but I was more interested in the sensibility by which we approach design, which is to break away from this object-based way of thinking and think about how what she's referring to could infuse our approach towards architecture.
Yeah, I think those points are very valid, and yeah, obviously, like I touched on those to a degree, but I think there's a lot more to be said about them, and you can find criticisms to that end in numerous journal publications as well. And I think I'm not sure if Helene, but I think definitely a few people from RMIT in Melbourne have written journal publications criticizing, especially emergence, the phenomenon in terms of talking about process and kind of adopting various sort of emergent behaviors, whether it's kind of flocks or this or that. But then in the end, what we sort of often see is this beautiful object, and it's this kind of fascination of this new digital technology of how we might model something. So I think there's definitely kind of that issue, and I think it also kind of comes down to even just really simple things like if you're practicing architecture, you need to deliver a building at the end for your client. You're delivering a product, and the client sort of wants to keep it at that beautiful handover point, and so that we don't just find that issue within kind of theoretical explanations in architecture and writing, but I think there's an underlying issue within the practice of architecture in that regard as well. And then you're having to obviously deal with the general public and their understanding of what architecture is and how it should behave, how it should perform over time. But I think that, Bernard Shumi's work is really interesting as well, because he is one of the very few people that does bring bodies into the equation through his concept of event, and talks about the importance of architecture. He's got this equation of architecture equals space plus event. And so, it's not just space as such, what we draw, but it's also what happens within those spaces. And he gives these kind of crazy examples of, I think, skydiving and elevator shafts and things like that, which are, very sort of provocative and, but, are fantastic as well, because they start to suggest that we might use spaces, not necessarily what they're programmed for, but, a space can support any number of actions, and that then sort of forms what the architecture is at that particular point in time. And so what architecture isn't necessarily static. So I think, all of those things together are really sort of critical in order for the discipline to sort of start to embrace, I guess, more sort of processual concepts, and not just take kind of a straight line from, starting here and making a building at the end, but actually kind of trying to do justice to that starting point, whether it is a concept from philosophy or wherever it might come from.
Can I bring Ian here, who's been very, very patient, because he's in Italy, and I don't know what time of the day or night it is there, but thank you for being here, and you'd like to ask your question?
Yeah. Thanks so much for Zuzana's lectures. It's really meaningful, and I'm in Italy now. It's almost 3 a.m. So, yeah. So yes, I'm very interested in your work and your topic and your ideas about objections. You explained very well how we can apply it on these objections to architecture, but I'm curious about how your ideas about the objections can apply to the study of the hyperdensities, urbanizations, and the hypercity space, like especially the public space and the infrastructures as all the public project, like that way. Yeah.
Yep. So at a larger scale, you mean? I guess what I've sort of mainly written about is a more sort of intimate scale, where you do kind of have a literal sort of exchange between a body and a space. But I think that can happen at a range of scales. That you don't necessarily have to be physically sitting in your house, for example, and engaging with the sort of materiality of the house. That can obviously happen within a public space or an urban space generally. And so, I think in that context, the sort of the important thing, I guess, to remember with objection is that, like, for me, it's essentially a material exchange as well, between a body or a space or any other kind of entity, whether it's, an animal or anything. And sometimes those exchanges are perceptible, but most often they're not. Yeah. And so, you may be within an urban space, and you may be, I don't know, going on a train and then walking to a library or a shop or doing all sorts of things, and you are physically interacting with the people that are around you. You are physically interacting with the spaces or the vehicles or whatever you come into physical contact with. And so there are kind of constant exchanges of matter, even though they are not perceptible, that are occurring. And so one of the things that I think that I find important in terms of trying to extend Kristeva's concept of the abject and abjection into architecture is to think about a lot of the writing that we find through new materialism, which talk about giving matter agency and also sort of understanding the world at the scale of matter. And Deleuze and Guattari touch on that as well. And at that scale, we sort of go from seeing a building then as an inanimate object as well, which maybe we see the objection over time if we kind of catalogue it over years and then we sort of speed it up. But if we have a look at a static object like a building at the level of matter, at a specific point in time, then we realize it's not inanimate, and we realize there's things happening. And so I think that is important to understand as well. So I think that that process of objection is definitely sort of applicable at any sort of architectural scale. It's always just a question of whether or not we perceive it or not, I think.
Yes, that's a great response. But you also mentioned the Kristeva's work and his books about Black Song. And I'm really interested about this book too, because it's very useful for me for my PhD studies about the emotional problems and the psychological issues, how can be impact as the rapidly extremely urbanizations, especially many the cases studies in China, like Shanghai and Hong Kong, and the extremely quick to be the globalization was cosmopolitan to the urban ways on individuals and the communities. And all of as also the homobabas focused to the hybridity and the cultural conflicts, how clashes in the urban city. So another question could be, how do the culture clashes and globalization contribute to the experience of depression and melancholia in urban community, and how are the possible the social political implications of depressions in urban areas, and how can that be addressed?
Okay. I think in that. So you're essentially interested in so cultural sort of differences, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, between like objection in this context, or you sort of
objections, and another like a country, the different person diversity, the cultural diversity, and the foreigners are living in a same community. I
think if I'm understanding correctly, I think that that's definitely an interesting point, sort of looking at different places within the world, or sort of cultural differences in terms of the abject and objection, and what might be considered abject or objection in those instances, because it is subjective, what we sort of are repulsed by, or what we consider abject, or what we don't, and I think that is definitely affected by your cultural background and your physical background as well, where you are living, and your potentially your personal situation or experiences as well, and so there's, I guess Kristeva sort of presents a general understanding of what it is, or what we might sort of all generally be repulsed by or consider abject, but then I think there are nuances or differences in other parts of the world to what that is, whether it is considered abject or not. So I think that's a very kind of interesting point, and it could be a good starting point for an article or a kind of research. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how, I mean, the tower block, which in somewhere like Hong Kong or Shenzhen, I mean, those actually are kind of similar. But you go to East Germany, and the kind of Plattenbau, the remnants of the socialist housing, nobody likes them at all, which is always kind of interesting question. Just I wanted to also for you, maybe you should look at the Kristeva's book about Chinese women. It was all part of it. She went to China with the Tel group a while back and wrote this. But I haven't read it, the book itself. But just to come back to French, actually, I would say that Francois, the name of his practice, if you pronounce it in French, it's heresy. So that's what he means when you're meant to pronounce it as heresy. That's what I was going to say. Okay, so we've got a question, several questions actually. But there's one from David Holtzman, who is here with us, and David is actually working on the theme of the object. He's an adjunct professor at NYU in landscape architecture. So I think he's kind of maybe saved from some of the kind of the limitations, shall we say, of the world of architecture itself. David, welcome.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, we have our own limitations for sure, but thank you so much. I'm really interested in so many of these themes that you were able to elucidate so much better for me. I'm feeling very selfish here to ask this question since it's so related to my own thoughts, but I'm wondering if with your tracing, I've been looking at how the genealogy of disgust theory, it uses Kristeva a little bit, and has really sort of run in maybe a different direction, I would say, with contemporary disgust theory and not being related to architecture and other kind of spatial questions around very similar themes. And so I'm wondering if you've been paying attention to any of those, and if you think there's any reasons just with your relationship with Kristeva's work, like what you think, for better or worse, most of the public sort of responds to or really takes from her, and what it seems like has been less embraced by other kind of lines with it. And I don't know if that's a fair question to ask, because you might not have been paying attention to those kinds of other conversations, but if you have a sense.
Yeah, look, I haven't been following disgust theory, so I'm not sure about that. But I think that it depends what context, I guess, you're asking about, whether, the abject and objection, or what parts of Kristeva's theory have sort of resonated, whether it's kind of within the architecture discipline, whether it's, in landscape, or kind of more generally. Within the architectural discipline, which is obviously my discipline and that I know most about, I would probably say that it's quite limited, and there's always, you might kind of find people sort of dipping in and kind of grabbing a few little things here and there, but no one really kind of, except for, Neil has his book about camouflage, where he does kind of, talk about Kristeva a little bit more extensively. But for the most part, people, don't tend to sort of pick up on a concept or an idea from her work and then sort of follow that through. It might just be mentioned in relation to, someone else, or a particular project that is being discussed, or something like that. So I think there's a lot that hasn't been discovered yet from her work. There's a lot that, there's a lot to learn, and it hasn't really come out yet, whether that's in architecture or I think in other professions possibly as well. There are probably things like within the arts, there was a whole abject art movement. So think in those sort of more artistic disciplines, there's maybe a little bit more of an engagement and maybe a little bit more of an awareness, particularly around the concept of the abject and objection. And also tied to that would be ideas about disgust and disgust theory. Yeah, that's probably what I would say, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat. Lila, who is, okay. My question is, my impression of abjection seems to be the result of natural circumstances and human just resisted abjection through a static and protected environment. Can abjection be man-made? If it's man-made, is it still abjection?
Interesting. I haven't thought about that. I guess it just comes down to what we are sort of repulsed by and what we find kind of, disgusting or as other than us. And so it might possibly extend to things that are made that don't occur naturally. And I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I think that as long as it fulfills those kind of key criteria, then there is a possibility that, yeah, we might have a similar reaction to those things. There probably always is going to be, I think, a stronger reaction to those objects that come directly sort of from us, that are kind of physical and that, were once part of our bodies, because there's a sort of an immediate nature and a sort of material and visceral quality to those, whereas I think if something is man-made, then you don't have those aspects to it. So there might be a bit of a difference there, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting interesting thing to wonder about.
Yeah, sorry. A second question also from Lila. And the horror we felt towards a corpse certainly is not the same as dust. Can we say dust is mildly disturbing for me, but a corpse can be shocking? When we're advocating for objection, to what degree are we talking about? That's a good question, actually. I like that question.
Yeah, I think you could definitely talk about degrees. Yeah, because you will have different reactions to different things that are expelled, and it might perhaps be like in the instance of the corpse, is that that person or that corpse is dead, therefore they can't sort of threaten you anymore in a way. Whereas something like dust or something like, I don't know, things that fall from your body, like whether it's hair or, I don't know, anything else, those things are still very much alive and they are able to be moved around. Wind can pick up the dust and the dust can come and touch your body, it can land on your body, and so on. And so perhaps the threat there and the repulsion is greater than with some other instances like the corpse, where it's literally a body that is sort of laying there and they can't physically kind of necessarily come in contact with you unless obviously you kind of walk up to it and you make contact. So then the agency sort of comes back to you to make that contact. Whereas I think if the agency to make the contact is not up to you, then there's almost more of a kind of a threat there, or more of a danger of contamination or interaction.
Yeah, I just wondered to what extent these are culturally determined. I mean, for example, in the UK, we would kind of like I guess frogs and snails are now being part of the kind of the repertoire of acceptable food, but for a long while it wasn't, and certainly in some places they eat dogs and snakes. I had a snake in China, But at the same time, a lot of people look at British culture and say, black pudding, isn't that blood? And I've been brought up with black pudding, but so it's something that it does seem to be culturally determined, right?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I agree.
So a question from Vasco, who had to leave because he had to go and teach. So he's in Bangladesh. So we're really straddling the world today. And it's actually a very good question. Let's put it in the chat. How does Kristeva's notion of semiotic language differ from traditional linguistic theories? And what are the implications of this difference for our understanding of language and communication? Let me read that again. How does Kristeva's notion of semiotic language differ from traditional linguistic theories, and what are the implications of this difference for our understanding of language and communication?
So I probably won't be able to answer that fully. Not really my area of expertise, but I think for me, like what I'm familiar with in terms of the semiotic in Kristeva's work, it is really sort of that state before the symbolic that she talks about. Which is sort of similar to, I guess, what Neil, you were talking about when you were talking about, you had the baby in the womb and talking about Freud. So it's very much that sort of psychoanalytic, I think, framework. And to me, I didn't really find much of a difference in terms of the way that Kristeva speaks about that. From Lacanian psychoanalysis theory, or even the way that sort of Freud, to an extent, describes that. So I think that there's a pretty good sort of similarity across those in that regard. But in terms of so the second part of the question was our understanding of language and communication. Was that, I don't know if that was generally or if that was within the architectural discipline.
I think it's a general question, although Vasco is an architect. He's a professor of architecture in Bangladesh.
Yeah. Look, I think the implications are basically as per sort of the psychoanalytic theories. It's very much sort of it's a way of kind of trying to understand and theorize our kind of gaining of subjectivity and our sort of divorcing ourselves from the mother and the father, and whether or not that is necessarily true. I think it is a theory to sort of think about, but yeah. So that's probably kind of the extent of my knowledge on that in terms of Kristeva.
Yeah. I wouldn't ask the question myself. It's a tough question. I've got a couple of comments coming in. People thanking you for this talk, and thank you for the amazing talk. But there's a rather perverse one. Let me mention, if I understood correctly, with the skydiving through the elevator shafts, there is an aerodynamic mechanic that would drag you towards the wall of the shaft if you're at then proximity to it. Area of and presumably that's from someone who actually hasn't skydived because he survived. But yeah, I think what I would say is that I think that Shuni was operating often at a kind of metaphorical level. I know, for example, that what he was doing. I mean, he was I've got huge respect for Shuni because he was the dean at Columbia who invited me to teach there, and allowed me to go and see. To sit in on Julia Kristeva's seminars, which I would say, just astonishing. I was absolutely amazed by the clarity of her thinking. Her precision was amazing. She has a beautiful mind, really amazing. But no, absolutely. He was known for his provocations. When he was teaching the AA, he was kind of collaborating or working with the IRA, which was outrageous at the time, and so on. And I think at some level, it's difficult to sort of talk about some of these things. I mean, when Bataille is talking about sacrifice, is he literally talking about sacrifice? It's kind of it seems to be operating at a very sort of metaphorical sort of level. It's a little tricky to therefore grasp what it's meant to be exactly. Is that fair? Or in terms of, well, I mean, I mean, when you're looking at Kristeva, it's all kind of at a kind of metaphorical level. You know, when we talk about death, we're talking about sacrifice, we're talking about all these things. It's not as though she literally means that. It's kind of somehow, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not like, you know, you're going to apply those directly to architecture or anything like that. So I think there's aspect to the work where it is sort of metaphoric, or it is kind of spoken about in a theoretical and a symbolic way. And so there needs to be sort of judgments about, you know, at what level is it discussed or pitched, and what level is it therefore kind of able to be adopted within different disciplines, whether that's architecture or elsewhere. But yeah, I think so in that sense, some of her writing kind of has more or less potential, I guess.
So we ought to wrap up soon. Gustavo, I don't know if you'd like to ask your question. I can read out for you, but it'd be good to, if you're seeing you're here in the Zoom chat, you'd like to ask it, Gustavo? Or...
Oh, sure. Thank you very much, Professor. I really enjoyed the lecture. I've been following, I guess, the abject through my education in the arts. And my question particularly comes from, how do you see a contemporary definition of the abject in relation to information or raw data? Because that's also material. It's also manages energy and kind of this human element, organizationally wise. So I just put down, how does the metaphor of the abject work with data that is raw or present versus orderly AI output using these tools like ChatGPT or Midjourney or DALL-E 2? How does the role of information disorganized versus organized work with that metaphor as well? Information is coming from the sciences with a theory of everything that seems to be beyond a binary. In process philosophy, how would you consider a framework in our contemporary world?
Yeah, I think that it kind of comes back to one of the earlier questions as well, where it was about talking about sort of degrees, I think, of the abject, and also sort of, I guess, to sort of work out whether the word abject or objection is applicable in any sort of context, whether it's raw data or whatever it might be. There needs to be a kind of an unpacking of what raw data is in this instance, and whether it kind of fulfills the definition that we find of the abject and objection within Kristeva's work. You know, I think simply you could just say, okay, well, anything that's kind of expelled or anything that's disordered, is that an abject or not? And has it come about through the process of objection? And so it then really comes to trying to think about, well, is it something that we are repulsed by? Is it something that, you know, kind of has a effect for breaking down our sort of boundary, our bodily boundary, and the way we sort of understand ourselves as a kind of a whole and complete entity or a thing, kind of within a phenomenological sense, or does it not? So it's almost, I think, a matter of asking yourself a series of questions whether that term or those kind of terms from Kristeva are applicable, or whether it's something else that is being discussed. But then there are also, I guess, different ways to interact with it, as you're saying, you know, talking about metaphorically. And so there were different ways of interacting with it through some of the projects that I showed in the lecture as well. You know, some projects sort of talk about it in a metaphorical sense. Other projects might engage with it in a more sort of literal and visceral way. So it might also be, again, a matter of the sort of type of engagement that occurs, or that you sort of choose to engage with.
Yeah. Well, Professor, I think that's what inspired the question when I saw the process art, because I'm thinking about computer scientists that create these algorithms that reorganize society. Those are human bodies. and their life and death consequences. So we can look at, I'm just thinking at a higher level, the abject here is at a planetary scale through an algorithmic lens. And these tools are creating outputs that are not real. They're derivative of real data. I'm also riffing off of Neil's work in AI too. This seems like it's a new territory. And I think with media arts or theory, Kristeva could breathe new life and critique to these tools instead of weapons, but tools for good.
Yeah, definitely, I think. And I think there are other areas as well where her work is applicable. You know, there's a lot of reading about and sort of writing and thinking through ecology at the moment, especially sort of within the architectural landscape disciplines. And, you know, ecology sort of as a kind of fundamental basis is very much about the organism and its relationship to the environment. And so I think even in that kind of realm, the sort of interaction between the organism and its environment and all of the sort of things that are in it, you know, Kristeva's abject and objection can play a big part in that as well.
Yeah, just one question. Have you seen the Abject show in New York? There was a really good show, I think, from the Whitney. I have that little catalog that I always think about when it comes to the definition of abjection. But I just wanted to say thank you very much. I'm so inspired and so thankful for your contributions. And it really gave me a new understanding or an idea of how I should think about architecture and especially contemporary data and where we're going through with quantum computing and AI. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.
Well, on that note, I think that's a perfect note to wrap things up. Thank you. I mean, thank you so much, Zuzana. It was really an eye opener or a door opener. You opened up a whole new world. I think that another world that actually I think has got incredible relevance, even though it might not seem that relevant straight away. But I think it does have that, and hopefully, what you've done is therefore kind of helped to sort of in this kind of leaky way to open up architecture to other discourses. I absolutely totally think that we need to destabilize this kind of neat hegemony that's going on in architecture in lots of different ways. And I think Julia Kristeva's got some fantastic comments to add and some insights and things, which it's really beholden upon us to try and sort of kind of convey and show to others how meaningful it is. But this has been a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was so enlightening for me to see this from a real scholar of Kristeva rather than a kind of Kristeva tourist like me. But I thought it was a tremendous thing, and thank you so much, especially on the other side of the world. It's not often we hear from that side of the world, but really it's because of the constraints in terms of the 24-hour clock. But it's been fantastic. It's really been a wonderful session. Thank you, Zuzana. Thank you also to the team behind this, and there's a whole team that's been working away behind the scenes, especially Pavline and Gustavo and others to make this happen. Everything is uploaded onto our website, onto our YouTube library. And we have one more session next week where we're on Tafuri, which brings it to an end. But there are three series. There are three series of this. Zizek, then the last one on Deleuze, which Helen and Derrida and Helen was part of, and so on. And I think it's really turning into something that is an incredibly useful resource that everyone around the world can access. So thank you, Shelley. You've done a great contribution, I think, to knowledge literally worldwide. I mean, today we had questions all over, and it'll carry on. Thank you so much, and let's hope to keep this discourse open. Let's make Kristeva even more relevant, because I think she's got a huge contribution that hasn't been realized yet, and you've done a great service to architects by opening up this today. It's fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you.
For having me, Neil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Bye.